The security guard's hands closed around her arm with bruising force as rain hammered against the glass towers of Meridian Industries. But Rebecca Matthews clutched her 3-month-old daughter closer, her designer coat, now 2 years old and fraying at the seams, offering little protection against the November cold. The man she'd once called her husband stood in the marble lobby, his new executive badge glinting under crystal chandeliers, but his eyes held nothing except contempt as he pointed toward the revolving doors and declared her too poor, too broken, too beneath him to stand on property he believed he controlled. What he didn't know, what the entire C-suite didn't know, was that the company he'd climbed through calculated betrayal and corporate backstabbing wasn't his kingdom but hers, built by her late father and hidden behind layers of legal trusts and anonymous holdings that had kept her identity secret, for reasons that would soon detonate like a bomb in that pristine lobby. The baby in her arms wasn't just the child he'd abandoned, but the granddaughter of the man whose name still hung in gold letters in the private executive floor he'd never accessed. But the board meeting scheduled for Monday morning would strip away every illusion he'd constructed about power, ownership, and the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. She walked into the storm with her daughter pressed against her heart, but she carried something he'd never see coming. Documents that would transfer from her hands to the board of directors, revealing not just her identity, but the systematic fraud he'd committed to reach his position. And what she would do next wouldn't just crush him, but erase him so completely that even the building's security logs would forget his name. How had a man who'd shared her bed, who'd promised her forever, who'd signed marriage certificates and birth certificates, become so blind to the truth of who she really was? What darkness had consumed the person she'd loved enough to hide her wealth and identity from, testing whether he'd love her for herself rather than her father's empire? And when Monday's board meeting exploded his carefully constructed lies, when her identity as the sole heir and true owner emerged from the shadows, would his destruction be swift? Or would she make him watch as everything he'd stolen, manipulated, and murdered his conscience to achieve crumbled piece by piece beneath her quiet, calculated revenge? The rain seemed to mock her as it always did, but Rebecca Matthews had learned long ago that weather cared nothing for human suffering. She stood outside the daycare center at 5:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before closing, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her phone as another text message notification lit up the cracked screen. "Where the hell are you? Sienna's been waiting for 20 minutes. If you can't handle basic pickup, maybe you should reconsider custody." The message came from Daniel, her husband of 4 years, father of her 3-month-old daughter Emma, but more recently a stranger who'd transformed into something cruel and unrecognizable. She wanted to text back that she'd been at the hospital with Emma, that their daughter had been running a fever of 103 degrees, that she'd been terrified and alone because he'd stopped answering her calls weeks ago, but her fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-tired acceptance that nothing she said would matter anymore. Instead, she pocketed the phone and pushed through the daycare entrance, but Ms. Carmichael's sympathetic smile told her everything before words could. Sienna's father picked her up about 30 minutes ago, the older woman said gently, but her eyes held questions she was too professional to ask. He said there was a change in the schedule. Sienna wasn't Rebecca's biological daughter, but Daniel's child from his first marriage, a 8-year-old girl Rebecca had loved and raised for 3 years as her own. But recently Daniel had been using the girl as a weapon, changing pickup times without warning, sending accusatory messages designed to paint Rebecca as neglectful and unstable. It was working, she realized with dull horror, but she couldn't fight back because fighting required energy she no longer possessed. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, but the words came out hollow as she turned back toward the rain. The apartment they'd shared, a modest two-bedroom in Queens that Daniel had insisted they rent. Despite Rebecca's quiet suggestions they could afford better, felt like a mausoleum when she entered. Emma stirred against her chest in the baby carrier, but the infant's fever had finally broken during the subway ride home, leaving her sleeping fitfully against Rebecca's heartbeat. The living room held boxes Daniel had packed 3 days ago, but he hadn't bothered to label them or explain where he was taking them, leaving Rebecca to discover his intentions through absence rather than conversation. She'd met Daniel 5 years ago at a charity gala she'd attended, against her better judgment, but her father had insisted she emerge from her isolated life, at least occasionally. "You can't inherit an empire if you don't understand how to move through the world," Gregory Matthews had told her 6 months before the heart attack that would kill him. But his voice still echoed in her memory, warm and certain and utterly convinced of her capabilities. "These people will smile at you because of the Matthews name, but I need you to learn who would smile at you without it." So she'd gone to the gala under an assumed name, Rebecca Martin, administrative assistant at a nonprofit, but she'd worn a dress from Target and cheap shoes that pinched her feet. Daniel had approached her at the bar, but his opening line hadn't been smooth or practiced. "You look as miserable as I feel," he'd said with a grin that seemed self-deprecating and genuine, but time would reveal how carefully he'd calculated even that first impression. "Want to escape to the terrace and complain about tiny portions and pretentious speeches?" She'd laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months, but what she didn't know was that Daniel had been watching her for 20 minutes, had seen her arrive alone, had noted her inexpensive dress and the way she'd flinched when the valet had asked if she needed help parking. He'd smelled vulnerability, but he'd played it as connection. Their courtship had been whirlwind, but not suspicious, grounded in what felt like shared values about money not mattering, about love being enough, about building something real together without the corruption of wealth. But Rebecca's father had watched with quiet concern. "There's something calculated about him," Gregory had mentioned once, but Rebecca had dismissed it as paternal overprotection. "He asked me about your work 3 times in one conversation, but when you mentioned the nonprofit's mission, he changed the subject to how much directors typically earn." "You're being paranoid, Dad," Rebecca had insisted, but that conversation had happened 2 weeks before Gregory Matthews collapsed in his office, dying before the ambulance arrived. The grief had been tsunamic, but Daniel had been there, solid and supportive and perfect in his attendance to her pain. He'd held her through crying jags, but he'd also started asking questions about her father's estate, about inheritance timelines, about whether there might be life insurance or property to settle. She'd told him the truth, or part of it. "Dad was comfortable but not wealthy," she'd said, repeating the lie her father's lawyers had coached her to tell, but omitting that Gregory Matthews had been the founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Industries, a chemical engineering firm worth $840 million. "There's a small trust that pays out monthly, but mostly I just have memories." Daniel had seemed to accept this, but his proposal came 6 weeks after the funeral, and his insistence on a small, private ceremony without extensive documentation felt romantic at the time, but calculated in retrospect. They'd married at City Hall with 2 witnesses pulled from the street, but Rebecca had signed the papers as Rebecca Martin, not Rebecca Matthews, maintaining the fiction her father had insisted she preserve until she was ready to claim her inheritance at age 30. "The trust is structured so you receive modest payments until you're 30. Gregory's primary attorney, Howard Chen, had explained the week before Gregory died, but the conversation had taken place in a hospital room where her father had been recovering from what they'd thought was a minor cardiac event. "At 30, the full truth transfers to you. Meridian Industries, all subsidiary holdings, the real estate portfolio, everything. Until then, you live on $3,000 a month from a basic trust, and the company believes it's being managed by an anonymous holding group. The board knows there's an heir, but they don't know it's you, and they don't know when you'll emerge. Why all the secrecy? Rebecca had asked, but she'd been 24 and naive about human nature. Because your mother married me for money, Gregory had said bluntly, but without bitterness, stating it as simple fact. And because I've watched too many heirs destroyed by people who loved their wealth more than their humanity. I need you to live in the real world first, to understand what people are like when they think you have nothing, to develop relationships based on who you are rather than what you have. When you turn 30, you'll have the wisdom to recognize genuine connection from calculated manipulation. She'd turned 30 3 weeks ago, but Emma's birth had delayed the formal transfer meeting that Howard Chen had been trying to schedule. We need to finalize the documents, Howard had called to say yesterday, but his voice had carried an urgency that felt new. There's been some irregularities at Meridian, and I think you need to know what's happening before Monday's board meeting. But before she could call Howard back, Daniel had come home with boxes and cold eyes, but his announcement had been efficient and brutal. I'm done, he'd said, setting down his briefcase but not looking at her. This isn't working, and I can't keep pretending I'm happy in this situation. I've rented a place in Manhattan, and Sienna's coming with me. What about Emma? Rebecca had whispered, but she'd been holding their 3-month-old daughter, feeling the infant's heart beat against her chest. You can keep her, Daniel had said, but the words had landed like physical blows. I can't handle a baby right now, and honestly, I'm not sure she's the future I want. We'll work out child support or whatever, but I need space. He'd left that night, but he'd taken Sienna, and he'd started a campaign of text messages designed to establish a narrative of Rebecca as unstable, neglectful, possibly unfit, building a paper trail that would serve purposes she was only beginning to understand. Now, standing in the hollow apartment with Emma asleep against her chest, Rebecca finally called Howard Chen back, but his assistant said he was unavailable until Monday morning. However, he did want me to tell you that Meridian's board meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday, the assistant said, but her voice carried a strange tension. He said you should definitely plan to attend, and that you should bring the original trust documents your father gave you. Rebecca hung up and looked at Emma's sleeping face, but the baby's features carried nothing of Daniel's sharp edges, all soft curves and innocent trust. We're going to be okay, she whispered, but the promise felt thin against the weight of uncertainty. The weekend passed in a blur of Emma's needs and the hollow space where her family had been, but Monday morning arrived with cruel punctuality. Rebecca dressed in her best outfit, a suit she'd bought for her father's funeral but hadn't worn since. Professional but not expensive. Appropriate but not attention-grabbing. But she added her father's signet ring, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept from him, heavy gold with the Matthews family crest engraved in the surface. Meridian Industries occupied floors 42 through 58 of a glass tower in Midtown, but Rebecca had never visited during her father's lifetime, maintaining the separation he'd insisted upon. The lobby was all marble and cold elegance, but the security desk held a young guard who looked at her with automatic dismissal, taking in her worn coat and the baby carrier she wore like a backpack, Emma awake now but quiet against her mother's chest. Can I help you? The guard asked, but his tone suggested he doubted it. I have a meeting with the board of directors at 10 a.m., Rebecca said, but she kept her voice even, betraying nothing of the authority she was about to claim. The guard checked his computer but found nothing. I don't see any visitors scheduled for the board meeting, he said, but then his eyes shifted past her and his entire posture changed. Straightening, becoming deferential in a way that made Rebecca's stomach clench. "Good morning, Mr. Foster. Can I help you?" Rebecca turned, but the world seemed to tilt as she recognized the man striding toward the security desk, corporate badge swinging from his neck, expensive suit sharp against his frame, confidence radiating from every calculated step. Daniel. But he wasn't Daniel anymore, or rather he'd never been just Daniel. The badge read Daniel Foster, VP of Operations, but his eyes swept over Rebecca and Emma, as if they were obstacles rather than family, as if the woman he'd married and the daughter they'd created were simply in his way. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, but he glanced around the lobby as if worried about witnesses, worried about appearances. "I have a board meeting," Rebecca said, but her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, diminished by shock. "You don't have anything," Daniel snapped, but he moved closer, lowering his voice to a vicious whisper. "You're embarrassing yourself, showing up at a corporate office with a baby strapped to your chest, like some kind of—" "Sir," the security guard interrupted, but he was looking at Daniel, not Rebecca, taking his cues from the person with the badge and the title. "Should I escort her out?" Daniel's eyes met Rebecca's, but what she saw there was worse than hatred. It was calculation, assessment, the look of a man deciding how much effort it would take to remove an inconvenience. In that moment she understood that everything had been a lie, but worse, that the lie had been intricate and long planned, that Daniel hadn't fallen out of love with her because he'd never been in love with her at all. "Yes," Daniel said finally, but he turned away as if the matter was already resolved. "She's confused, possibly mentally unwell. I'll be upstairs if there are any issues." The security guard's hand closed around Rebecca's arm, but his grip was firm, insistent, pulling her toward the revolving doors. Emma started to cry, but the sound echoed in the marble lobby, bouncing off cold surfaces that cared nothing for infant distress. "Please," Rebecca said, but she was looking past the guard to Daniel's retreating back, watching as the man who'd promised to love her forever stepped into an elevator without looking back. "Please, I have documentation, I have—" "Ma'am, you need to leave," the guard said, but his voice had hardened, no longer polite but forceful, treating her like a threat. The rain had intensified while she'd been inside, but it soaked through her coat in seconds as the guard deposited her on the sidewalk and turned back to his post. Emma wailed against her chest, but Rebecca stood frozen, staring up at the glass tower that held her father's legacy, her company, her birthright, but which had just rejected her as if she were nothing. Her phone buzzed, but it was a text from an unknown number. "Howard Chen asked me to contact you. There's been a situation. Daniel Foster has been systematically falsifying company records and embezzling funds for the past 18 months, but he's done it carefully enough that the board hasn't caught on yet. Your father's death created a window where oversight became lax, and Foster took advantage. We need to talk before the board meeting, but if you're outside Meridian right now, don't try to get back in. Foster has security flagged to keep you out. Meet me at the address below in 1 hour." The address was a law office 6 blocks away, but Rebecca started walking, Emma's cries gradually subsiding into hiccuping sobs. Her mind spun through revelations that were clicks into place like puzzle pieces. Daniel's sudden attentiveness after her father's death, his questions about the estate, his insistence on a quick private wedding, his recent abandonment that had seemed cruel but now felt strategic, distancing himself from her before Monday's board meeting, where her identity would be revealed, establishing a narrative of her instability, positioning himself to claim he'd been deceived about her mental state, but he'd made one critical miscalculation. He didn't know she was the heir. He'd thought, or the company gossip had suggested, that Gregory, Matthew's heir, was a son, possibly overseas, definitely not the sad woman in the cheap coat he'd married and discarded. The law office was small but elegant, but the receptionist seemed to expect her, leading her immediately to a conference room, where Howard Chen sat with another man, younger, sharper, with eyes that catalogued everything in seconds. "Rebecca," Howard said, but his voice carried relief mixed with concern as he took in her soaked coat and the baby. "Thank God you're here. This is Marcus Webb, head of our corporate fraud division. Marcus, this is Rebecca Matthews, sole heir and owner of Meridian Industries." Marcus stood, but he didn't offer platitudes or small talk. "Your husband, Daniel Foster, is going to jail," he said bluntly, but he spread documents across the conference table, each one a damning piece of a larger mosaic. "He's been embezzling through false vendor contracts, kickback schemes, and manipulated supply chain reports. Total estimated theft is $23 million over 18 months, but he's been sophisticated about it, routing funds through shell companies and offshore accounts." Rebecca sank into a chair, but her hands moved automatically to soothe Emma, who'd finally settled into exhausted sleep. "How did he even get hired at Meridian?" she asked, but the question opened doors to darker revelations. "He applied 6 years ago, 2 years before he met you," Howard said quietly, but he slid a file across the table. He'd been researching Gregory Matthews for years, trying to find angles into the company. When Gregory died and the board was looking to fill vacant executive positions during the transition, Foster had positioned himself perfectly. Right experience, right credentials, right timing. "We think he knew about you before he approached you at that gala." The room tilted, but Rebecca forced herself to breathe, to process, to understand. "He targeted me," she whispered, but it wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus confirmed, but his expression held something like sympathy. "He thought marrying you might give him insider information about the heir, about the trust structure, about when the transition would happen. When you told him there was just a small trust, he pivoted, started stealing what he couldn't access through marriage, building his own fortune while positioning himself as indispensable to the board." "The baby?" Rebecca said suddenly, but horror washed through her. "Emma, he abandoned her because Monday's meeting will reveal you as the owner," Howard finished grimly, but his jaw was tight with anger. "And he can't be married to you when that happens. Can't have a child with you that would complicate his claims of ignorance about your identity. He's establishing distance, building a narrative that he was deceived, that he married someone he thought was a poor administrative assistant, not a corporate heir." Rebecca looked down at Emma's sleeping face, but rage was building beneath the shock, cold and clarifying. "The board meeting," she said, but her voice had changed, hardened. "What's the agenda?" "Standard quarterly review," Marcus said, but he pulled up a digital file. "Except Foster has added an item, a proposal to restructure executive compensation and equity distribution. If it passes, he'd secure significant ownership shares based on his exceptional performance. He's going to try to lock in wealth and position before your identity is revealed." "Then we need to move the revelation forward," Rebecca said. But she was already planning, calculating, seeing the board like pieces on a chessboard her father had trained her to play. "What if I attend the meeting not as the heir, but as Daniel's wife? Not announced, not expected, just someone who wandered in to support her husband." Howard and Marcus exchanged glances, but Marcus smiled slowly, recognizing a predator awakening. "That could work," he said, but he started pulling additional documents. "But you'd need to be careful. Foster has support on the board, people who've benefited from his schemes, people who don't want scrutiny of the last 18 months. "Then we give them a choice," Rebecca said, but Emma stirred against her chest, the baby's tiny hand curling around her mother's finger. "We let Daniel present his proposal, let him think he's won, and then we detonate the truth. Not just my identity, but his fraud, his theft, his systematic betrayal of everything this company stands for. The next hour was spent in preparation, but Howard walked Rebecca through the documents she'd need, the statements she'd need to make, the legal authority she'd be claiming. Your father designed the trust so that at 30, everything transfers automatically, he explained, but he showed her the paperwork. You don't need board approval. You are the board's employer, not the other way around. Monday's meeting is technically your first day as acknowledged owner. And Daniel doesn't know, Rebecca confirmed, but she was thinking about every conversation they'd had, every lie he'd told, every moment she'd believed his performance. He has no idea, Marcus agreed, but he looked at her with something like respect. But Rebecca, you need to understand. This is going to be brutal. He'll fight, he'll lie, he'll try to destroy you to protect himself. Are you ready for that? Rebecca thought about the security guard's hands on her arm, but she thought about Daniel's eyes in the lobby, cold, dismissive, looking at her like trash to be discarded. She thought about Emma growing up knowing her father had abandoned her when she was 3 months old. But she thought about Sienna, too, that 8-year-old girl who'd called her mommy and who'd been weaponized in Daniel's games. I'm ready, she said, but the words carried a weight that surprised even her. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, but Rebecca dressed differently this time, not in her funeral suit, but in a tailored dress her father had bought her for her 25th birthday, expensive but understated, paired with the signet ring and simple pearl earrings. Emma was with a lawyer-approved babysitter, but Rebecca carried the documents in a slim leather portfolio, evidence of authority and ownership. The lobby security guard was different this time, but he checked her ID and nodded her through without questions. Board meeting is on floor 58, he said, but he handed her a visitor badge. Elevator Bank C. The executive floor was hushed elegance, but the boardroom itself was visible through glass walls, a long table surrounded by 15 leather chairs, most already occupied by board members in expensive suits, reviewing agendas and making small talk. Daniel sat at the head of the table, but on the left side, not quite in the chairman's position, but close, confident, preparing to present his proposal. Rebecca walked through the door, but she didn't announce herself, simply took an empty chair near the back of the room, setting her portfolio on the table quietly. Daniel's head jerked up, but his face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then fury so fast it was almost comical. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded, but his voice was loud enough that conversations died, board members turning to stare. Supporting my husband, Rebecca said calmly, but she met his eyes without flinching. I thought I'd observe your important meeting. This is a closed corporate board meeting, Daniel said, but he was standing now, appealing to the other board members. She doesn't have clearance to be here. Security should have stopped her. I have visitor clearance, Rebecca said, but she touched the badge. And I'm not interrupting. Please continue with your agenda. The board chairman, an older man named Robert Sterling, who'd worked with her father for 30 years, looked between them with visible confusion, but he cleared his throat. Mr. Foster, if your wife is simply observing, I don't see the harm. We can proceed. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he sat back down, clearly calculating whether making a scene would damage his position more than allowing her presence. He chose to continue, but his presentation was slightly rushed, his confidence fractured by her unexpected attendance. As you'll see in the materials distributed, Daniel began, but he clicked through a PowerPoint. Meridian's operational efficiency has increased 23% in the 18 months since I took over supply chain management. Cost reductions total $47 million, with projected savings of $60 million annually going forward. The numbers were impressive, but Rebecca recognized them from Marcus's fraud analysis, inflated by ghost vendors and manipulated contracts, real savings mixed with fictional achievements to create a picture of exceptional performance. Based on these results, Daniel continued, but his voice grew stronger as he hit his stride. I'm proposing a restructuring of executive equity compensation. Key personnel who've driven this growth should be rewarded with ownership stakes that reflect their contributions. Specifically, I'm requesting the board approve a 7% equity transfer to be distributed among top performers, with the majority, 5%, allocated to the VP of Operations position. 5% of an $840 million company was $42 million, but Daniel was trying to steal it through board approval, locking in wealth before the ownership transition could stop him. That's a significant request, one board member noted, but she, Margaret Chen, head of finance, was already reviewing the numbers with a skeptical expression. I'd like our auditing team to review these figures before we approve such a substantial equity transfer. Of course, Daniel said smoothly, but his smile was calculated to convey reasonableness. I'd welcome scrutiny. The results speak for themselves. Actually, Rebecca said quietly, but her voice cut through the room like a blade, I think there's information the board should have before voting on this proposal. Every head turned toward her, but Daniel's face had gone pale, his confidence finally cracking. Rebecca, this isn't the place. My name is Rebecca Matthews, she continued, but she stood, opening her portfolio and distributing copies of documents to each board member, moving around the table with calm precision. Daughter of Gregory Matthews, sole heir to his estate, and as of 3 weeks ago when I turned 30, the full owner of Meridian Industries and all its holdings. The silence was deafening, but she watched understanding detonate across faces, Robert Sterling's eyes widening with shock, Margaret Chen's expression shifting from confusion to sharp calculation, other board members processing implications faster than words could convey. That's impossible, Daniel said, but his voice was strangled. You don't... These documents confirm my identity and ownership, Rebecca continued, but she returned to her seat, maintaining calm control, even as her heart hammered. They're certified by Howard Chen of Chen & Associates, the legal firm that managed my father's estate, and the trust structure he designed to protect me until I was ready to assume control. Rebecca, Robert Sterling said carefully, but he was studying the documents. If this is true. It's true, Howard Chen said, but he entered the boardroom from a side door, Marcus Webb and 2 other attorneys behind him. Gregory Matthews designed this trust specifically to allow his daughter to mature without the burden of her identity, to understand the world and people's motivations before assuming control of significant wealth. That transition completed on her 30th birthday, 3 weeks ago. Daniel was standing again, but his hands were shaking, his carefully constructed world collapsing in real time. You lied to me, he said, but he pointed at Rebecca as if she were the villain. You told me you had nothing, that your father was just comfortable. I told you what my father instructed me to tell people until I was 30, Rebecca said, but her voice was ice. He wanted me to see who would love me for myself, who would value me as a person rather than as wealth. You failed that test spectacularly. This is insane, Daniel said, but he was appealing to the board now, desperate. She's mentally unstable. I filed for separation because she was having delusions. She needs help. Actually, Marcus Webb interrupted, but he opened his own portfolio, distributing a different set of documents. What needs help is explaining 23 million in fraudulent transactions you've conducted over the past 18 months. Ghost vendors, kickback schemes, manipulated supply chain reports. Your exceptional performance is actually exceptional theft, Mr. Foster. The board erupted in shocked murmurs, but Margaret Chen was already on her phone, calling security and legal. Daniel's face had gone from pale to gray, but he tried one last gambit. "You can't prove any of this," he said, but his voice was weak. "This is a setup. She's trying to frame me because I left her." "We have your financial records," Marcus said calmly, but he displayed a screen showing account transfers, shell company structures, paper trails that led inexorably back to Daniel Foster. "We have testimony from vendors you created, employees you bribed, contracts you falsified. And we have the timeline that shows you applied to Meridian 6 years ago, 2 years before you conveniently met Rebecca at a charity gala and launched a calculated romance designed to get close to the Matthews family fortune." Rebecca watched Daniel's face as understanding hit him. Not just that he was caught, but that he'd been caught by the woman he'd dismissed, discarded, kicked out of a lobby while claiming she was beneath him. The irony was poisonous, but she felt no satisfaction in it, only a cold determination to protect what her father had built. "You targeted me," she said, but her voice was quiet enough that only Daniel could hear. "You researched my father, found out about me, stalked me to that gala, created an entire persona designed to make me fall in love with someone who never existed. You married me, got me pregnant, and then abandoned your own daughter when you thought distancing yourself from me would protect your fraud." "Rebecca," Daniel started, but his voice broke. "The baby you threw away is your daughter," Rebecca continued, but tears were threatening now, her control cracking slightly. "Emma is 3 months old, and you told me you weren't sure she was the future you wanted, that you couldn't handle a baby right now. But what you meant was that you couldn't handle being connected to me when my identity was revealed, couldn't risk having a child who would prove you knew exactly who I was all along." Security entered the boardroom, but they moved toward Daniel, not Rebecca. Robert Sterling had made a call, but he was shaking his head in disgust. "Mr. Foster, you're terminated effective immediately, and criminal charges are being filed. You need to leave the building." Daniel looked at Rebecca one last time, but what she saw in his eyes was neither remorse nor love, just rage that his plan had failed, that the woman he'd thought he'd broken had instead broken him. "You'll never prove I knew who you were," he said, but it was his final card, his last desperate play. "Actually," Howard Chen said, but he held up a document. "We have the prenuptial agreement you tried to get Rebecca to sign 2 weeks before your wedding, the one she refused. In it, you specifically referenced any future inheritance from the Matthews family estate. You knew her real name, you knew about her father, and you tried to lock down rights to her inheritance before she refused to sign." The color drained from Daniel's face, but he had no response, no explanation that could overcome that single damning piece of evidence. Security led him from the room, but his exit was the opposite of his confident entrance. Diminished, destroyed, erased. The board meeting continued, but it was surreal. Rebecca formally introducing herself, answering questions about her father's vision, outlining her own plans for Meridian's future. She spoke about maintaining the company's commitment to ethical chemical engineering, about expanding into green technology, about her father's belief that corporations had responsibilities beyond profit. "I know I'm young," she said finally, but she looked at each board member in turn. "And I know some of you might question whether I'm ready for this role. But my father spent my entire life preparing me, teaching me, showing me what leadership meant. He showed me this company not as an inheritance but as a responsibility, and I intend to honor that responsibility." Robert Sterling spoke for the board, but his voice carried respect. "Gregory talked about you constantly," he said quietly. "Not by name, because he honored the trust structure, but he called you the heir, and he believed you'd be extraordinary. Watching you handle the last hour, the grace, the strength, the clarity, I think he was right." The meeting ended, but Rebecca stayed behind as board members filed out, most stopping to introduce themselves properly, to welcome her, to express shock about Daniel's betrayal. When the room was finally empty except for Howard and Marcus, she let herself collapse slightly, exhaustion and adrenaline crash hitting simultaneously. "You did well," Howard said, but he squeezed her shoulder. "Gregory would be proud." "He'd be horrified I fell for Daniel's act," Rebecca countered, but she was thinking about all the ways she'd missed the signs, ignored the warnings, chosen to believe in love rather than listening to instinct. "He'd understand that you were human," Marcus said, but he started packing up documents. "And he'd be impressed by how you handled the exposure. That was surgical, Rebecca. You gave Foster just enough rope to hang himself." Rebecca gathered her things, but she thought about Emma waiting at the babysitter's apartment, about Sienna who would need careful handling as Daniel's fraud became public, about the company she now owned and the responsibility that came with it. "What happens to Daniel now?" she asked, but she already knew the answer. "Criminal charges, probably 5 to 7 years minimum," Marcus said, but he was matter-of-fact. "Civil suits from the company to recover stolen funds, complete professional destruction, and given his abandonment of Emma, you'll have no problem securing full custody." The thought should have brought satisfaction, but Rebecca felt only emptiness. She'd loved Daniel once, or she'd loved the person she thought he was, but that person had never existed. The man being led away in handcuffs was a stranger who'd worn her husband's face, performed her husband's role, but who'd never been anything except a calculated predator. She left Meridian Industries that afternoon as its owner, but she carried the weight differently than Daniel had worn his stolen authority. Her power was real, earned through her father's trust and her own resilience, but it came with knowledge about human darkness that she'd never wanted. The apartment in Queens felt different when she returned, but she realized it was because she was seeing it through new eyes, not as the home she'd shared with Daniel, but as a temporary space she'd occupied during a chapter that was ending. Emma was sleeping when the babysitter handed her over, but the infant's tiny fingers curled around Rebecca's thumb, trusting and perfect and entirely dependent on her mother's strength. "We're going to be okay," Rebecca whispered, but this time the promise felt solid, built on truth rather than hope. "I'm going to build you a life where you're safe, where you're valued, where you know your mother fought for you, even when the world tried to erase us." The weeks that followed were intense but clarifying, but Rebecca hired a team of executives she trusted to help run Meridian while she learned the operations. She moved out of Queens into a brownstone in Brooklyn, not ostentatious but comfortable, a home where Emma could grow up with space and light, but without the isolation of extreme wealth. She enrolled Sienna in therapy and fought for shared custody, despite Daniel's fraud, refusing to let his mistakes destroy his daughter's stability. Daniel's trial was brief but devastating, but he maintained his innocence even as evidence buried him. The media coverage was brutal. "Executive husband defrauds wife's company" ran as headlines, but Rebecca refused interviews, maintaining privacy as her father had taught her. 6 months after the board meeting, Rebecca stood in her father's old office, now her office, but she'd changed almost nothing, keeping his desk, his chair, his books. A photograph sat on the credenza, Gregory Matthews holding an infant Rebecca, both of them laughing at something off camera, but the joy in the image was uncomplicated and pure. "I understand now, Dad," she said to the photograph, but her voice was quiet. "You knew people would hurt me, but you also knew I'd survive it. You knew I'd be stronger for understanding darkness as well as light." Her assistant knocked, but the interruption was gentle. "Ms. Matthews, the board is ready for the quarterly meeting whenever you are." Rebecca straightened her suit, but she touched her father's signet ring, now worn openly, a symbol of legacy and responsibility. Emma was in the company daycare 3 floors down, being watched by staff Rebecca had carefully vetted, but the infant was thriving, growing, becoming her own person, separate from the trauma of her father's betrayal. The board meeting was routine but productive, full of discussions about expansion, ethics, sustainability, the kind of leadership Gregory Matthews had modeled but which had been corrupted during the window of his death and Rebecca's delayed inheritance. Robert Sterling had become her mentor, but other board members had earned her trust through consistent integrity. After the meeting, Rebecca returned to her office, but she found Marcus Webb waiting, holding a file. "Final update on the Foster case," he said, but he set the documents on her desk. He was sentenced to 7 years, but with the civil suits, he'll be paying restitution for the rest of his life. His professional reputation is destroyed, his CPA license revoked, his name permanently associated with fraud. "And Sienna?" Rebecca asked, but she already knew some of this. "Custody was granted primarily to you," Marcus confirmed, but he smiled slightly. "Daniel's parents have visitation rights, and they're grateful for how you've handled their son's destruction. They apologized to you, actually, said they'd seen signs of his narcissism for years, but never thought he'd go this far." Rebecca nodded, but she thought about Sienna calling her yesterday, excited about a school project, addressing her as Mom without qualification or hesitation. Daniel's daughter had chosen her, but Rebecca had earned that choice through consistency and love, through showing up even when it was hard. "There's something else," Marcus said, but his expression shifted to something more personal. "I know this is probably too soon, and you have every right to tell me this is inappropriate, but I wanted to ask if you'd consider having dinner with me. Not business, not legal consultation, just dinner. 2 people getting to know each other." Rebecca looked at him, but she saw the careful hope in his expression, the vulnerability of someone risking rejection. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified, too damaged to consider trusting another person. But her father's lesson had been about recognizing genuine connection, and Marcus had been nothing but honest, professional, and supportive through the worst period of her life. "I'd like that," she said, but she smiled. "But you should know. I come with a 3-month-old who doesn't sleep through the night, and an 8-year-old who needs to approve of anyone I date. And I own a company worth nearly $1 billion, which means you'll need to be okay with people assuming you're with me for my money." Marcus laughed, but his relief was visible. "I think I can handle that," he said. "Besides, I've already seen you at your most vulnerable and your most powerful. That's a pretty solid foundation for getting to know someone." Rebecca walked him to the elevator, but as he left, she caught her reflection in the glass. No longer the broken woman in the rain, no longer the victim Daniel had tried to destroy, but someone stronger, wiser, carrying scars but not broken by them. Daniel Foster's story was one of complete erasure, but not in the way he'd feared. His name was removed from Meridian's records, his achievements, real and falsified, expunged from corporate history as if he'd never existed. The $23 million he'd stolen was recovered through asset seizure and insurance claims, but the deeper damage he'd done, to Rebecca, to Emma, to Sienna, to the company's culture, took longer to heal, but heal it did, slowly but inevitably, built on Rebecca's leadership and her refusal to let Daniel's betrayal define her future. She transformed Meridian into a leader in sustainable chemical engineering, hiring diverse teams and implementing transparency measures that made the company a model for ethical corporate governance. She established a foundation in her father's name, but focused on supporting young women in STEM fields, creating opportunities Gregory Matthews would have championed. Emma grew up knowing her father's story, but not as a cautionary tale about men, as a lesson about recognizing genuine character versus performance, about the importance of building your own identity rather than deriving worth from relationships. By the time Emma was 5, she barely remembered Daniel, calling Marcus Dad and understanding that family was built through choice and commitment rather than biology alone. Sienna flourished in therapy and in Rebecca's stable home, but she eventually reconciled with her father in limited, supervised contexts, learning that she could love him while acknowledging his flaws, maintaining relationship without sacrificing her own well-being or security. By her teenage years, she was working at Meridian during summers, learning the business her mother now ran, carrying forward the legacy in her own way. And Rebecca herself transformed in ways she couldn't have predicted, but the woman who'd been kicked out of a lobby for being poor became known as one of the most effective and ethical CEOs in her industry, speaking at conferences about corporate responsibility, publishing papers about sustainable business practices, using her platform to advocate for transparency and accountability. 10 years after that rainy Monday morning, Rebecca stood in the same Meridian lobby, but this time she was welcoming shareholders to an annual meeting. The security guard from a decade ago, the one who'd thrown her out, was long gone, but his replacement knew exactly who she was, greeting her with respect that was genuine rather than performed. She'd kept one photograph from her marriage to Daniel, not displayed but stored in a safe, showing the two of them at their wedding, both smiling, but Rebecca's eyes in the image carried a naivety that was almost painful to witness. She looked at it occasionally, not to torture herself, but to remember that the capacity for trust was a strength, not a weakness, even when that trust was betrayed, because the alternative to trust was isolation, and Gregory Matthews had not raised his daughter to hide from the world. He'd taught her to engage with it fully, to lead with integrity, to recognize that being hurt didn't mean you had to become hard, that maintaining humanity in the face of betrayal was itself a form of triumph. Daniel Foster served his sentence in a minimum security facility, but emerged to a world that had completely forgotten him. His professional connections had evaporated, his reputation reduced to a cautionary tale in business ethics courses, but his name a byword for corporate fraud. He attempted to reach out to Emma twice, but was denied contact by court order until she was old enough to decide for herself. When Emma finally met her biological father at age 18, it was at her own insistence and in Rebecca's presence, but the meeting was brief and unsatisfying. Daniel had aged badly, diminished by prison and regret, but he still couldn't quite apologize, still couldn't fully acknowledge the calculated cruelty of what he'd done. Emma left after 20 minutes, but she turned to Rebecca in the parking lot with clear eyes. "Thank you for letting me make that choice," she said, but she hugged her mother. "And thank you for being strong enough that I didn't have to wonder what I was missing." Rebecca held her daughter, but she thought about the woman in the rain, about the baby strapped to her chest as she was thrown out of her own company's lobby, about the moment when everything seemed lost. That woman had survived, but more than that, she'd transformed her survival into something generative, building a life not in reaction to Daniel's betrayal, but in alignment with her father's values and her own emerging wisdom. The final irony was that Daniel had been right about one thing. Rebecca Matthews was worth vastly more than Rebecca Martin, the poor administrative assistant he'd targeted and married. But the value he'd missed entirely was that Rebecca's worth had never been about money. It was about integrity, resilience, the capacity to love even after being devastated, and the wisdom to recognize that true power came not from what you could take, but from what you could build and protect and transform. And in the end, that was the revenge that mattered most. Not his destruction, though that had been necessary, but her reconstruction. She'd taken the ruins of what he'd tried to leave her with and built something extraordinary, proving that his assessment of her as weak, as forgettable, as easily erased, had been the most catastrophic miscalculation of his calculated life. Because Rebecca Matthews, daughter, mother, owner, leader, had learned her most important lesson not from her father's business wisdom, but from the experience of being thrown away. That your value is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you treat yourself and others in the aftermath of betrayal. And by that measure, she was priceless. But Daniel Foster had been worthless long before the court sentenced him or the company erased him. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration of dignity, of truth, of the fundamental understanding that actions have consequences and that no amount of calculation could protect someone from the reality they'd created through systematic cruelty. And sometimes, just sometimes, the woman dismissed as nothing became everything she was meant to be, not despite the betrayal, but through the strength she discovered in surviving it.